Michael Reaves had co-written novels with Steve Perry going all the way back to the 1980s, so they joined up forces again for the Medstar duology, part of the Clone Wars multimedia project that was released between 2002 and 2005. Perry was also no stranger to Star Wars, having written the novelization of Shadows of the Empire, the sort of inter-episode between The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. If you look at Michael Reaves' bibliography, you'll notice that he co-writes a lot of novels. I think that he enjoyed the process of working collaboratively, but also because of his Parkinson's, he found the ability to type increasingly more difficult as his disease progressed. I remember really enjoying the Medstar duology, liking that it was sort of like a Star Wars pastiche on MASH, but I hadn't read it in years, so I wasn't sure how it was going to hold up to this reread. So, a brief summary. While the Clone Wars wage, the doctors, nurses, and Jedi Padawan Barriss Offee, who are all stationed on the jungle planet of Drongar, work very hard to keep the clone troopers, as well as other individuals within the Army of the Republic, alive during endless battles. But while they work tirelessly to save the lives of those around them, others seek to profit from this war, either by black market schemes or by manipulating the outcomes of the Clone Wars itself. So first, a timeline disclaimer. Within the chronology, or rather the original chronology of the Clone Wars, because the 3D animated show rather messed this all up, Medstar duology is meant to be set 2 years after the Battle of Geonosis. As the story begins, we meet the healers who are stationed on Rimsu 7, this mobile medical unit on Drongar. So we have the surgeons Jos Vondar, who is a human from a very insular group on Corellia, as well as Zan Yant, who is a Zabrak from Talos, also in the Corellian system, interestingly enough. We have Tolk Latrine, who is the nurse, and she is from the planet of Lord, which, like Garrick Lauren or Face from the Race Squadron books, the Lordians are humans, but they are very good at reading body language. And so Tolk is very good at looking at someone and knowing what they're feeling just from how they're presenting themselves. We have their psychiatrist or their minder, Clo Merritt, who is an Equadi and he's very empathetic. We have Bariss, who's been sent to Drongar, both to help the surgeons in the operating theater, but also to investigate what is happening with the Boda, which is a local plant that can be used to create antibiotics and other sorts of medicine. And it's been going awry, some of it, the shipments. We have a Celestin reporter named Dhur, who's trying to dig into all sorts of stories here. And we have the return of I-5, the droid from Darth Maul's Shadowhunter, who still doesn't quite remember all of his past, but has now been assigned to help the medical staff on Rimsu 7. And then on the more villainous front, we have Admiral Blade, who is sort of the overseeing officer for these medical units, but he's doing bad things. We have his associate Philba the Hutt, who is sort of in charge of supplies and is the main one that is redirecting Boda to elsewhere. We have several Black Sun operatives, one who's killed, one who kills people. And then we have an unnamed agent who is working for both Black Sun and the Separatists under 2 different code names. And Reaves and Perry make it very clear that the identity of the spy is not going to be revealed in this one. We don't even know the gender of the spy, just what they have been up to thus far. So unlike the other Clone Wars novels, which really follow significant Jedi characters, our only Jedi here is Bariss. You're familiar with her, especially if you've read The Approaching Storm, the prequel to Attack of the Clones, but that's it. It's basically a character study of all these different characters, the trauma and events they go through during the Clone Wars, and some of the realizations they come to along the way. In the case of Barriss, she's here as a Jedi healer, but she's also here as an investigator. But it doesn't feel like she does much investigating, because most of the investigating is what Dhur does as part of his journalistic duties. Instead, Barriss mostly seems here to struggle with her feelings towards Fo-Jai, one of the combat instructors, who is not a very nice man. He hates the Jedi. He views the Clone Wars as an opportunity to kill people and get away with it. And Barriss's interactions with Fo-Jai involve her having to learn how to balance her personal feelings against her demands as a Jedi, that she does not like this man. She absolutely hates him, but she can't take out her anger on him because that's the dark side. She also recognizes that while she may not agree with what he's doing, that while what she sees him doing is outright murder, that because it's wartime, it's basically condoned by the powers that be. And she's not sure how she feels about that. Barriss comes upon Fo-Jai and he's dying, and she saves him using her Force abilities, only for Fo-Jai to turn around and throw his life away in a suicidal attack on more separatist forces. If anything, I think the Clone Wars novels have shown us how this constant conflict is changing the Jedi and making them have to come to realizations that they probably never would have had during times of peace. And since this is a duology, Barriss's arc will obviously continue into the second book as well. The surgeon Jos Vondar is, I think, the character in Medstar that has the closest analog to a character from MASH, which was a book, and then it was a film, and then it was a very long-running American TV show that ran from the 70s into the 80s. I would say that Jos's analog in MASH is Hawkeye, because they both have a very sardonic, sarcastic quality, as well as like a skirt-chasing quality. With Jos, how that plays out is that, like Corran Horn from the X-Wing books, he is constantly evaluating the attractiveness of the people around him. But at the same time, he comes from this very insular community on Corellia, which is not keen at all on people pursuing people outside of that community. There's this whole thing of Xters and Nsters, and he's expected to eventually marry someone from within that community on Corellia or within the Corellian system. But he has feelings for Tolk, the Lordian nurse, and she's Xter. So a fair bit of his emotional journey is coming to terms with whether he thinks it's okay to pursue a relationship with someone who's not from the same background as him. And he eventually decides that because of some of the traumatic events that happen in this book, that life is short. He likes Tolk. He wants to get to know her better. And if that means pursuing a relationship with her, even though she's not from his background, that's something he's willing to do. And while we don't have a viewpoint character who's a clone like we did in the Cestus Deception, we do still have some of that more philosophical questioning about the nature of clones, and that, again, plays out within Jos's arc. Almost for his own mental well-being, Jos has sort of classed clones in with droids, that they're all the same, they're pretty much interchangeable, they've been bred for war, and they're not really human. But as he interacts with them, and especially sees a clone trooper grieving the loss of one of his brothers, he realizes that he can't group everyone in like that this clone trooper legitimately feels lost and had a genuine connection with another clone trooper that he had spent his entire life with. And I think the introduction of I-5 into the group here also leads to Jos's revelations that I-5 is different from the other droids he's encountered. And if I-5 can be different than other droids, then surely none of the clone troopers are identical, and that even though they've had similar upbringing, similar training, and they're genetically the same, that their personalities can develop to be very different. We have Zan Yant, who comes from a wealthy background and is also a very talented musician and uses his musical ability to deal with everything that he's encountering here, that he uses music as a way to escape and unwind. Zan also finds that they cannot use Boda on their patients, something that is not right. That the Republic would have them stationed on this world that has this life-saving antibiotic, and then they're not able to use it on any of the patients who come through their care, and Zant does not agree with that, and Zant is secretly using Boda to treat some of the troopers and some of the other patients. And Jos finds out, but Jos is willing to turn a blind eye to it because why would you not help people within your care? I liked getting to see I-5 again, to see that he's still trying to work out his missing memories, and also just to see how unique of a character he is, that he has a sense of humor, which most droids don't have. An interesting character to read about. Dhur, the little Celestian journalist, is there as a wartime correspondent because he thinks that's where the most interesting stories are to be found. And he's really keen on bringing down Philba the Hutt because they have past history and they don't get along. But he starts to realize that the plot is much more tangled than he initially assumed. That's not just Philba selling supplies on the black market, but that there is a higher-up officer involved. And he also wants to write an expose on Fo Jai, that this is a man who is using the excuse of war to commit murder, but his story gets twisted against him to make Fo Jai out into a hero, something that he's not sure he wanted in the end. He also doesn't really care for anything, but in the very end, when they're having to evacuate the Rimsu from their current location to another one, he literally risks his life to save Zan's instrument. Even though he'd said he didn't care for anyone or anything, in the moment, he recognizes that Zan needed his Kitara to cope with what's happening around him. And because Zan is an amazing artist, he's willing to risk his life to save that instrument for his friend. Of course, the tragic bit comes in that in trying to escape from the battle that's coming to Rimsu 7, Zan is killed. He knows that Dhur saved his instrument, and that's the last happy thought he has, because then he takes a piece of shrapnel to the brain and dies instantly. And that's something that the characters will have to be coping with in the next book, is the loss of one of their very close companions. On the bad guy front, Philba is a typical Hutt who is just trying to profit himself, but he's also not very courageous, and when it looks like he's about to be uncovered, he's killed. Admiral Blade, the Sakian, who's working with Philba to misdirect items, especially the Boda, for his own personal gain. This is one bit where I wish that we could have had pictures of some of these alien characters, because like Clo Merritt, the Akani, I'm guessing that he's like a horse-type alien, but without Wikipedia to look it up, I would not have known that. And with Blade, he's a Sakian, and I had no idea that that was one of the alien species that appear in the Mos Eisley Cantina, but once I was able to see what they look like, I had a better grasp of him, that his father lost their family honor, he wants to regain it, but he's trying to regain it in a way that is completely immoral and illegal. We have two Black Sun operatives that come to speak with Blade. The first is killed by Blade, and the second one is a Nadiji, this avian species, who's very tricksy and will carry over into the second book. And I guess I have to say my first issue with Battle Surgeons is that Reeves and Perry really killed off like all our villains in this book. which really only leaves Caird the Nadiji and the unnamed spy to carry over the second book. And I found that an interesting choice, and I'm not sure it was the right one, to have these antagonists like Philba and Blade and Fojai, and then just to kill them by the end of book 1. And then you're sort of wondering, well, then what is book 2 going to entail? Obviously, they're going to have to figure out who the spy is, and I guess Caird's going to do stuff, but it seems like the black market reign is ended, and Fojai's gone, and there aren't going to be any more confrontations with him. So I'm not sure that it was the right choice to just wipe so many of the bad guys out halfway through the story. I also felt like the MASH elements didn't always work with the character backgrounds that we've been given here. And I think that's especially the case for Jos, where making Jos the sardonic ladies' man doesn't really fit very well with his background as being from this insular group on Corellia who don't really have relationships with people outside of that, because I guess it's an instance of, he's noting people, but he's not pursuing it. But I just was honestly surprised that he would even note people if that's the kind of background he came from. That, the Hawkeye elements of his character didn't always work very well with the backstory that he'd been given. I think, too, is that some of the characters were better fleshed out than others. We spend a lot of time with Jos and with Dhur and with Bariss, but as a result, it felt like Zan and Tolk were less fleshed out. That Tolk is there for Jos's emotional problems. She's beautiful and she's interested in him, but should he be interested in her? But all we really get of Tolk is that she's Lordian, she's a very capable nurse, but we're never in her viewpoint, so we don't get much more of a deep dive into her character. And with Zan, it felt like we would see Zan through other characters' eyes, that he comes from this wealthy background, he could be a concert musician instead of a surgeon, and he's trying to help the people around him even when he's doing it through illegal means. And his death does hurt, but since we're never really in his head like we are in Jos or Dhur, I didn't feel the same sense of loss that I would have felt if one of them died. But again, they're the main characters. And also with the spy plotline, I have to say that going into book 2, I have absolutely no idea who the spy is. The spy is obviously doing things and is one of these characters, but I guess we'll have to wait and see what their identity is, because we haven't gotten any hints at all who this individual could be. So in short, I really enjoyed revisiting the first book in the Medstar duology. Yes, it's like a MASH pastiche set within the Clone Wars. We don't get any of our main characters here. Our only Jedi viewpoint at all is Barriss Offee. But it's a really interesting character study of both Bariss and the non-Jedi healers that she works with. We get to see a side of the war that we haven't seen thus far, the medical side, as well as characters' impressions of the clones, and just how morally sticky things become during time of war. That you could have a character like Fojai, who's not a nice man, yet is still depicted as a hero at the end. I'm interested in continuing with the duology and seeing if that novel as well holds up to my memories of it. So next time I'm going to be reading, book 2 in the Medstar duology by Michael Reeves and Steve Perry, Medstar II, Jedi Healer.